again, and I'll try and stick to my 20 minutes assiduously. I don't think I managed it yesterday. So my task is to canvass some of the realities and myths about food security and outline, without turning it into an advertisement, what my department seeks to do about it as one contributor to the cause. Our first observation is that food security is, of course, is a global issue. An FAO definition is that it's accessed by all people at all times to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet dietary needs for a productive and healthy life. There's a lot in that. And while there are distributional and access limitations in the world food system, if I can call it that, there is enough actual product available to meet the needs of the entire global population, but nonetheless an ongoing challenge subject to those distributional and access questions, but also future pressures to meet the growing world demand for food, as we would all know, due to global population rises, the change in size and nature of per capita demand for food, increased climate variability, and increasing competition for key resources. None of that would be news to anyone here. Australia is in a particular segment of food security, if you like, from a world perspective. It's not an issue for us as a nation feeding ourselves, or largely at least feeding ourselves. We obviously have a comparative advantage in food production and therefore are a substantial exporter, contributing to global food security without worrying too much about our own. We provide, or the export of agricultural products does provide significant income to Australia, generates employment, all that. There is an opportunity to boost the volume, value and quality of our food production, but serious constraints to overcome in trying to do that, and I'll return to that theme later. But to perhaps say it broadly, our challenge is to improve productivity and competitiveness in this industry in an environment of climate variability and increasing competition for key resources. And I would add to that, actually, in a climate of, I guess, heightened aspiration to redress the balance between production and environmental protection. And I guess as affluence rises, we become increasingly willing and desirous of spending some of our national wealth on reducing the negative impacts of our production systems. Equally, because we're affluent, we can supplement our food supply domestically grown with imports where necessary, which we frequently seek to do more on preference grounds than on basic sustenance and necessity grounds. We shouldn't be sanguine. I had a wonderful set of notes from my staff here, which was attempting, and I think rightly so, to say essentially we have no food security problem in Australia. I couldn't help myself but say, to add this point, I don't think we should be sanguine about food security in an absolute sense for this country. There is such a thing as Food Bank, which I was told about last week by its managers, which distributes something like 19 million free meals per year. They get donated food from industries that have, companies that have essentially got stocks beyond about to reach their use-by date that they don't believe they can sell. They take that donated food. They have their own logistical system. They actually give it to what you might call the welfare retailing sector, which gives it in turn to its clients, and all of that is supported by quite substantial government subsidy. So it does signify that for some households and some individuals, obviously those of low socioeconomic status, they do depend on large-scale philanthropy and government subsidy, and the traditional or the standard food system for them doesn't work. Now, in some corners of popular commentary, and this issue has been debated extensively in my department and indeed across our government, food security is synonymous with self-sufficiency on a small scale. And I emphasise in some corners of popular commentary. Obviously there's another view. So it's self-sufficiency on a small scale is one perspective on it, that's how you achieve food security, or alternatively it's concerned with the availability of food with ostensibly sustainable characteristics. Now this we would perceive to be a reaction to the perceived environmental cost of commercial irrigation and indeed fossil-fuelled farming, and would also observe that virtual water and food miles, which in a sense are the symbols of this perspective on food security, are erroneously used to justify return and you'll forgive me for a little poetic licence here, to the backyard vegetable patch in the community garden as the mainstays of food supply. Now I would assert that reducing food miles and virtual water as policy goals would be perverse and would reduce food security, and they'd have no reliable benefit to sustainable use of water and energy. I don't need to lecture this audience. Partial measures are a poor guide to overall environmental impact. Equally, small-scale production has inefficiencies and externalities, notwithstanding that it has educative and amenity benefits. And you're looking at someone who was a backyard farmer for many years and is still a backyard composter. But I shudder to think if somebody made me buy my emission permits or justify other aspects of my production system, that the audit would come up very well. Now, of course, climate and water risk do, instead of actually compelling a contraction to this self-sufficiency paradigm, actually compel a strengthening of global food markets, I would assert, just to provide greater immunity to local production shortages in a world which, as I said earlier, is subject to substantial risk in food production deriving from climate and water. Now, undoubtedly, further opening trade has distributional consequences, and the people that argue for self-sufficiency would argue this point too. Now, again, I don't have to tell this audience that overall opening trade done in the right way with the right regulatory framework around it should be positive overall, but of course possibly negative for some communities at some times. The remedy for that isn't trade restrictions, but careful planning, change management, essential in opening markets, pursuant to my points of yesterday, and of course complementary policies. And it's also important to say that some non-tariff barriers, such as for biosecurity, about which we'll hear more, may be justified on food security grounds. In fact, it may actually prevent disruptions of production to have, and does do so in fact, to have good biosecurity systems. But you've always, in looking and establishing those, be aware of the potential for protectionism to drive regulation as distinct from legitimate concerns about production. Another an element of the food security debate which is quite prominent and arresting is the claim that catastrophic food shortages leading to famine confront us, brought about by population growth and climate risks. And we would assert that quite simplistic concepts akin to the limits to growth arguments underlie those fears. And indeed, as global markets develop, we would expect the risks will be increasingly to price rather than to physical shortage. Of course, price can still induce famine of sorts, but at least there is an answer to that, which is a transfer of wealth through subsidy to avoid the famine or at least mitigate its impacts. Disruptions to production can, as we've seen in recent years, impact on affordability and in extremes accessibility to particular types of food. And future disruptions will put the most poor and remote at significant risk at some time, so not denying there is a risk. But trade is at the front line of the defence against this risk, and coordinated relief action by governments and private sectors, which are the fallback when indeed the trade fails to provide the supply that's required, and we rely upon other mechanisms to ensure that people get what they need. But to repeat, the answer is not a false nirvana of self-sufficiency. However, let's not deny that sustainable agricultural practices will be crucial to long-term global food security. Business as usual is not an option. Nonetheless, though, I should actually say business as usual in large-scale production will have to give way to sustainability, but does that mean a complete transformation and contraction of the scale of industry? We don't think so. So there are two underlying concerns in sustainability at the moment that are probably more prominent than most, and that is to address the environmental impact of water interception, a big issue in Australia, Murray-Darling Basin debate having been prominent in recent months, and the carbon intensity of transport. So an answer to the environmental watering concern is to have environmental watering strategies directed at maximising, or at least optimising, the amenity and value of the environment at an affordable cost, but not to aim for a reduction in virtual water content as your driver. That would be a perverse and distorting way of approaching the problem. And the other, of course, is in relation to carbon, is carbon pricing to internalise externality and drive innovation in transport technology and in energy sources, not to target a reduction in food miles. Deal with the outcome, don't deal with the partial measure as your driver of reform, and you should end up with an efficient response. Now, it may well be, this is something I've toyed with a lot, having some background in energy, it may be that the emissions intensity of bulk transport, to go to a specific point here, is harder to reduce than many or most other energy-related emission sources. So may simply mean that stationary energy and indeed industrial emissions and other sources do more to tackle the global mitigation challenge under carbon pricing than does transport, at least bulk transport. Indeed, consumer transport does clearly have options to contribute to the emissions abatement task. That's not necessarily wrong. If we end up with a lower emissions signature, but transport efficiently plays less of a part in achieving that, because we want to be connected by trade and by movement of people, then that is potentially an appropriate outcome. Now, I mentioned the Murray-Darling Basin Plan before, thinking about environmental watering. There we have an attempt to bring economic, social and environmental outcomes into balance, a more optimal approach than the virtual water metric. The concept is ambitious, it's even laudable to try and optimise a resource management a challenge in the way it's attempting to do. Good concept, but the execution has been to date regrettable, as the Victorian Government's recent submission made public to the MDBA makes clear. Our analysis did reveal fundamental and avoidable flaws in the recent guide to the plan. And indeed, in the cause of the environment, there is a curious impulse, which is shared by many, that the higher the cost of mitigating environmental impact, the better. It's almost like we have to do penance, and we have to actually pay above the odds in order to show that we care. And therefore, that efficiency, being something about industry, has no place. Well, careful choices, we would disagree with that fundamentally. Careful choices are required about the environmental assets and features and values to be protected and the means of protecting them. And the fact is that efficiency of the environmental use of water is a must. And we certainly would recognise that irrigation water withdrawals, by purchase or by whatever means, will likely reduce food production by value, particularly in the short to medium term. That's a fact. The question is, how do you get those costs to reflect society's aspirations? The cost and the benefits, that is. The restoration of river health, speaking of benefits, and icon sites will produce benefits, largely to amenity and biodiversity, secondarily to the economy. But because it's at a cost, we need to make every drop of environmental water count, as indeed we do with irrigation itself. Now, there is anecdotal evidence that food security concerns appear to be, and this is a matter of some conjecture, leading wealthy and import-dependent economies, not necessarily national governments, but in some cases maybe with their tacit or other support, to buy foreign land to ensure their own future food supply. Now, this is a very touchy subject. Foreign ownership is perceived as a challenge to community support for open trade, particularly were it to serve national food supply ends. Of course, on the other hand, foreign ownership of farmland has the potential to raise productivity, create jobs and increase global food security. Frequently, foreign investment comes associated